The doctors said hope was gone. My son hadn't moved in half a year. Until one day, a janitor walked in with an old radio and danced like no one was watching. Ben Walker had built a life out of order, efficiency, and silence, the kind of silence that filled boardrooms, not hospital rooms. Once a powerful CEO with answers for everything, he now stood helpless in the shadow of a question no amount of logic could answer. Would his 9-year-old son Eli ever wake again? After the accident that left Eli paralyzed and unresponsive, Ben withdrew from the world, shutting himself and his son inside a sprawling farmhouse in Maple Ridge, Kentucky, surrounded by machines, monitors, and the ghosts of his own making. He dismissed therapists like chess pieces, demanding progress in a world where healing had no formula. That was before Grace Ramirez arrived, not with credentials, but with quiet presence. She came to mop floors, not to heal a boy. But when Eli's eyelashes flickered one morning to the rhythm of her humming, something shifted. In the stillness between her steps and his breath, a fragile thread formed, one that would unravel everything Ben thought he knew about control, connection, and the kind of love that doesn't need to be spoken to be real. Ben Walker had once been the kind of man whose presence could silence a room without raising his voice. As CEO of a multi-million-dollar logistics firm, he lived by precision, data, and control. Nothing in his world was left to chance. His calendar ran in 15-minute blocks, his coffee was measured to the gram, and even the width of his necktie knots was calculated for visual dominance. But none of that mattered anymore. Not since the accident. Not since the day his 9-year-old son Eli was pulled from the wreckage with his spine broken, his voice gone and his eyes wide open but unreachable. Ben sold the company within a month, vanished from corporate headlines, and retreated into the Kentucky farmhouse where he and Eli now existed in a strange kind of suspended reality. The house, once bustling with advisors and staff, now felt like a sealed box, sterile, still silent. Eli's room was the heart of it all. A dimly lit space lined with monitors, machines, and medical charts where the boy lay unmoving on a custom bed. A breathing tube curled at his mouth. His tiny fingers limp at his sides. Ben had tried everything, top neurologists, experimental therapies, virtual reality stimulation, but none of it changed anything. Eli didn't speak. He didn't blink on command. He didn't move. Ben couldn't accept that. Not from a world that had once given him everything he demanded. He hired and fired with merciless speed nurses, physiotherapists, speech pathologists. Anyone who didn't produce measurable progress was gone by week's end. He watched them all from behind a wall of cameras, tracking every twitch, every anomaly, every silence. But deep down, beneath the control and the rage, there was fear. A bone-deep terror that this was it. That the boy who once clung to his hand at bedtime would never reach for him again. Ben didn't talk about that part. He didn't cry. He just stared at the monitors night after night, willing anything to change. By the time Grace Ramirez walked through the side entrance of the Walker estate, Ben had already dismissed 8 nurses, 5 physical therapists, 3 neurospecialists, and 1 world-renowned child psychologist in just under 4 months. Each had arrived with glowing credentials, advanced techniques, and unwavering optimism, only to leave hollow-eyed and defeated, escorted out quietly by security before the end of their second week. Ben didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. A subtle tightening of his jaw, a clipped "thank you for your time," or the cold stare he reserved for disappointment was enough to end any contract. His expectations were clear: results or removal. Progress, no matter how minor, or he would find someone else. To him, every failed professional wasn't just a letdown, they were thieves stealing time from Eli. Time the boy might not have. He tracked their sessions meticulously, reviewing hours of surveillance footage each night like a CEO analyzing quarterly losses. He had even created a spreadsheet where he logged every micro-movement, every suggested technique, and how many days each specialist lasted. There were no improvements, no eye contact, no response to sound, to light, to the world. Ben had no patience left for empathy. Empathy didn't make his son move. It didn't fill the void at dinner where a chair remained empty, or replace the weight of Eli's laughter, which used to bounce off the walls like sunlight. One nurse, Mary Beth, had stayed the longest, 14 days, before breaking down in the hallway and whispering that she thought Eli just needed time and love. Ben fired her that same hour. Love didn't solve spinal trauma. Time was the enemy. Ben didn't care how kind they were, how hopeful or spiritual or soft-spoken. If they couldn't make Eli blink, lift a finger, or utter a sound, he had no use for them. This wasn't cruelty, he told himself. This was war. And in war, sentiment was a luxury no commander could afford. Ben Walker didn't believe in hope. He believed in data, in numbers that told the truth even when people refused to. Chart scans, response matrices. Those were the languages he understood. Emotion was an inefficient currency, easily manipulated and rarely accurate. He had built an empire by ignoring feelings and trusting algorithms, and he approached his son's condition with the same brutal logic. If Eli couldn't respond to stimuli, if no neurological patterns changed, then the conclusion was clear: nothing was working. But beneath that cold framework, cracks were starting to form. Ben was running out of solutions, and worse, running out of explanations. Every morning he stood beside Eli's bed and reviewed the overnight monitor logs like a man hunting for signs of life in an abandoned city. Heart rate steady, brain activity low. Muscle tone unchanged, no variation in blink reflex, no response to auditory triggers. It was like watching a tide that never came in. Still, he refused to accept the verdict of the doctors, who used gentle terms like minimal consciousness and prognosis uncertain. Those words were too soft, too vague. He needed certainty, not comfort. He fired one neurologist simply for using the word miracle in a sentence. To Ben, miracles were just statistical anomalies waiting to be debunked. But as the days stretched into weeks, then into months, something began to shift inside him, not in a loud or dramatic way, but like a floor slowly sinking beneath its own weight. The silence of the house grew heavier. The distance between him and Eli felt less like a medical condition and more like a canyon he couldn't cross. Every time he spoke to his son and heard no response, a piece of his logic fractured. And yet he clung harder to his systems. He had nothing else. Letting go of the data meant stepping into something far more terrifying: faith. And Ben Walker did not do faith. He could not afford to. Because if he let himself truly feel, then he'd have to admit the one thing that terrified him more than losing Eli, the possibility that his son was already gone, and all he had left was the soundless shadow of a life he couldn't control, fix, or bring back. Grace Ramirez wasn't supposed to be there. Her name hadn't passed through Ben Walker's meticulous screening process, and she certainly didn't arrive with the polished resume or polished diction of the professionals who came before her. She was a last-minute replacement from a local agency called in after the previous cleaning staff abruptly quit. No one paid attention when she signed in at the side entrance of the Walker estate, with her worn sneakers and frayed canvas bag eyes down, hair tied in a practical knot. But from the moment Grace stepped inside that house, something quiet and almost imperceptible shifted. She didn't rush. She didn't speak much. She moved through the wide, echoing rooms like someone who understood silence, not as absence, but as presence. To the outside world, Grace was invisible. Middle-aged, olive-skinned, soft-featured, with no formal education beyond high school, and no credentials that would earn her respect in a room full of specialists. But what she had, what no degree could quantify, was the ability to notice what others overlooked. She didn't flinch at the medical equipment, didn't ask questions about Eli, and didn't make small talk. She simply showed up each morning at 6 a.m., humming softly in Spanish as she filled her bucket and cleaned the house with the kind of care that made you wonder if she was trying to heal the floor itself. Grace didn't ask to enter Eli's room. She simply followed her list. But the first time she did, she paused at the doorway not out of fear, but reverence. She greeted the boy not with pity, but with a gentle, "Good morning, sweetheart," as if he were simply resting. She cleaned around his machines with delicate precision as if dusting a cathedral, and when she finished, she'd sometimes sit in the chair beside him for a few quiet minutes, hands folded, whispering stories he couldn't respond to, but stories she felt he might still hear. Grace never once looked up at the ceiling camera. She didn't know Ben watched, and even if she had, she wouldn't have changed a thing. She hadn't come to fix the boy. She came to clean the room. But Grace Ramirez knew, in the way only the broken-hearted ever do, that sometimes the most powerful healing begins when no one is asking for it. Grace Ramirez didn't speak much, and when she did, her voice came out like something folded gently between pages. A soft hum, more than a sound, never hurried, never loud. She moved through Eli's room with a reverence most reserved for places of worship. At first, her time there looked no different than in the other rooms. She wiped down surfaces, swept corners, changed linens, and adjusted the blinds with practiced hands. But then came the moments when she thought no one was watching, those in-between minutes when her mop had done its job, the air was still, and the world outside was nothing more than a distant hush. That was when she danced. Not grandly, not with spinning flourishes or dramatic gestures, but with subtle, flowing steps, just enough for the hem of her uniform to sway slightly, and for her slippers to whisper across the floor like breath against skin. It wasn't choreographed or theatrical. It was instinct, a quiet offering. She would glide toward the window, then back toward the bed, always keeping her eyes on Eli, as if tethered to him by something invisible. And while she danced, she would hum, not pop songs or lullabies, but old ranchera melodies her grandmother used to sing while stirring pots of beans in a trailer back in Santa Rosa. The kind of music made for healing wounds no one could see. Eli never moved, but Grace spoke to him with her body, with the weight of each step, the rise and fall of her breath, the slight lean of her torso as she pivoted toward his chair. Her movements were a language no one else in that house knew. It wasn't performance, it was prayer. A way of saying I see you without asking for anything in return. Grace never assumed Eli could hear her or understand, but she acted as if he did. And something about that made the sterile room feel different, less like a hospital chamber, and more like a quiet chapel where the rules of science didn't reach, where maybe something deeper might be listening. Grace Ramirez never knew about the camera. Hidden discreetly behind the molding of Eli's bedroom bookshelf, it was one of 7 high-definition surveillance feeds Ben Walker had installed throughout the house, silent, seamless, and always on. To Grace, the room was private, sacred even, a place where silence held weight and eyes could rest without judgment. But to Ben, watching from his dimly lit study down the hall, it was a theater of failure, or at least it had been. For months he had seen nothing but routine nurses making notes, therapists applying techniques, charts updating in real time, all producing no change. Until Grace. At first she annoyed him. She didn't speak to his son like the professionals did. She didn't bring equipment charts or methodology. She didn't even follow the patient care protocol. But instead of correcting her, he found himself watching, noticing. She would enter with her mop and bucket like it was any other room, but something in her demeanor was different, so uncalculated, so unaffected by the cold machinery that filled the space. He watched her take slow steps across the floor, noticed the way she paused by Eli's side as if waiting for permission from the boy himself. And then one day, as the late afternoon light spilled in across the polished wood, she began to move. Grace didn't know she was being observed as she slipped her mop aside and let her feet glide into slow, rhythmic steps, circling once near the window, once again near the bed. Her head tilted toward Eli, her hands gently swaying, her lips barely parting in a soft hum that Ben couldn't hear but could almost feel through the screen. She did it again the next day, and the next, not for show, not for science, simply because something in her body needed to. Ben didn't understand what he was seeing. It defied logic training, all medical explanation. Yet he couldn't look away. Night after night, he queued up the footage, eyes fixed on the silent, grainy image of a woman who didn't know he existed, and a boy who hadn't blinked in 6 months, lying motionless, listening to the quiet dance of someone who believed he still could. It happened on a Tuesday morning just after sunrise, when the house was still cloaked in that soft gray quiet, before the machines began their steady whir, and the monitors resumed their rhythmic blinking. Grace Ramirez entered Eli's room as she always did, without ceremony, without expectation, just her mop, her bucket, and the quiet hum of an old Spanish ballad drifting from somewhere deep in her memory. It was a lullaby her grandmother used to sing when the summer air was thick and the nights refused to cool, a tune worn down by decades of repetition and love. Grace wasn't thinking about science or therapy or miracles. She was thinking about home, about mango trees and cracked porches, and the way music used to stitch broken things together, even if just for a few minutes. As she bent down to wring out the mop, Her voice caught the melody, and she began to hum softly at first, just enough to fill the space between beeps and silence. Her back was turned when it happened. Eli's eyelid twitched once, then again, deliberate, purposeful. Not a reflex, not a fluke, but a flicker. A moment. His gaze, once fixed in empty space, shifted slightly toward the sound as if something inside him recognized the tune, or perhaps the emotion beneath it. Grace, unaware, continued humming as she moved to the corner of the room. But in the hallway, Nancy had paused with a breakfast tray in hand and caught the subtle movement through the open door. She stepped closer, eyes wide, and whispered Eli's name. He didn't blink again, but the shift had been real, undeniable. Later, when Ben reviewed the security footage as he did each night, he saw it too. He rewound it 3 times, froze the frame. There it was, a blink, just one. But for a boy who hadn't moved in 6 months, it was the equivalent of a scream. Ben stared at the screen for a long time afterward, no words, no data points. Just a woman humming an old song to a boy the world had already given up on, and the smallest, most extraordinary proof that he might still be listening. Nancy Hill had worked for the Walker family for nearly 8 years, long enough to know that miracles didn't happen in this house, or if they did, they were buried under layers of silence, grief, and protocol. She moved quietly through her routines each day, never intruding, never speaking unless spoken to, especially now, especially since the accident. But that Tuesday morning, as she stepped into the hallway outside Eli's room with the breakfast tray balanced in her hands, she noticed something she couldn't explain. Grace was inside as always, humming that soft, haunting Spanish melody like it belonged to another world. Nothing unusual there. Grace had developed a rhythm all her own in that room, one that Nancy respected but never interrupted. She was about to turn away when she saw it. Eli's eyelid flickered. Not the involuntary spasms that sometimes tricked hopeful observers, but a deliberate, almost tender blink, first one, then the other. His head didn't move, his hands remained limp, but Nancy froze, her breath caught mid-step. She leaned in, gripping the edge of the doorframe, eyes locked on the boy she had set breakfast trays beside for months without a single response. "Eli," she whispered, heart pounding in her chest. The boy didn't move again, but the blink had been there, real, undeniable, imprinted in her memory like a shockwave. For a moment she doubted herself. Had she imagined it? Was it just wishful thinking, the kind she'd buried long ago to survive the stillness of this house? But the hum continued. Grace dancing ever so slightly as she mopped, oblivious to the tiny miracle behind her. Nancy didn't wait. She placed the tray down with shaking hands and hurried toward Ben's study, her sensible shoes nearly slipping on the polished floor. She didn't knock. She burst in. "Ben," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to check the monitor. Now." "Eli." He blinked. Ben looked up from his desk, startled eyes narrowing in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" She swallowed hard, holding his gaze. While Grace was singing. "I saw it." He blinked. Not a twitch, not a spasm. He heard her. And in that moment, for the first time in half a year, the air in the Walker house shifted from resignation to something that almost resembled hope. Ben didn't run. He never ran. But as soon as Nancy's trembling words sank in, he blinked, while she was singing. He stood up so fast his chair scraped backward with a screech against the hardwood. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her again, just turned and moved quickly down the hall to the locked cabinet in his study, where the surveillance console was kept behind biometric access. His hand shook slightly as he pressed his thumb to the scanner and entered the room. The bank of monitors glowed to life, sterile and cold. He scrubbed through the footage for Eli's room, time-stamped from that morning, 6:48 a.m. There was Grace, just as Nancy had said, mopping the floor in that quiet, strange rhythm of hers, body moving softly to the hum of a melody he couldn't hear through the muted feed. Ben leaned in. His breath slowed. His fingers hovered over the pause button. He watched her step toward the window, the light catching her profile, and then back again near the bed. That's when it happened. Eli's eyelid twitched, not once but twice, a slow, almost graceful blink, deliberate. Not a reflex. Ben froze the frame, his heartbeat suddenly loud in his ears. He rewound it, watched it again and again. There was no mistaking it. A blink, a signal, a response to something, to her. He searched for logical explanations, a muscle spasm, a trick of the light, an error in the frame rate. But the data didn't lie. Eli blinked exactly when Grace passed by her voice, surely the only sound in that sterile room. It made no sense. None of the high-priced specialists with their machines and metrics and advanced stimuli had produced anything close. Yet here she was, a cleaner no degree, no training, humming an old melody, and somehow reaching his son in a way science had failed. Ben sat down, slowly staring at the screen, one hand pressed to his temple, as if trying to hold back the tidal wave of confusion. It was impossible. And yet, he had seen it with his own eyes. For the first time in months, his carefully constructed certainty fractured, letting in something dangerously close to belief. By noon the next day, Dr. Lila Harrington, one of the nation's most respected pediatric neurologists, was standing at the foot of Eli Walker's bed. She had flown in on short notice at Ben's request, briefed only with the phrase, "possible new activity observed." The surveillance footage had been sent to her encrypted the night before, and while she admitted the blink was curious, she warned against false hope. An isolated eye movement, she had said, does not constitute cognitive response. Still, Ben insisted she come. He needed confirmation proof that what he saw wasn't some desperate projection of a grieving father clinging to shadows. Dr. Harrington spent the next 4 hours with Eli, performing every standard and advanced test in her arsenal. Her team ran silent stimuli tests, recorded pupillary response rates, tracked minute motor impulses with microsensors, and scanned brain activity for any anomaly. Ben stood behind the glass wall, watching every second, arms crossed, jaw locked tight. Grace was not in the room. She hadn't been called. This was science now. This was how it was supposed to be done. But when Dr. Harrington finally emerged from the room, clipboard in hand, her expression was composed, clinical, measured. "I know you're hoping for more." She began choosing her words carefully, but neurologically, Eli's condition remains unchanged. There's no new measurable brain activity, no response that passes threshold. It could have been an involuntary blink. Ben didn't flinch, but the words landed like a dull blade. He asked questions, pressed her for nuance. Was it possible the tests were too rigid? Could emotional stimuli, like music, trigger non-quantifiable responses? Harrington shook her head gently. What you saw may have felt real, but in clinical terms, there's no evidence of recovery. I'm sorry. Ben nodded, once tight and mechanical, thanking her without emotion. As her team packed their equipment and left, he returned to the control room alone and watched the video again. Blink. Response. Something was there. It didn't fit their models. It didn't meet their thresholds. But it was real. And for the first time in his life, Ben Walker began to wonder if the truth couldn't always be measured. Ben Walker had built his entire life on systems, on measurement, verification, and repeatable outcomes. So when Harrington dismissed the blink as a meaningless anomaly, he didn't argue. He simply shifted gears. That very evening, after the specialists had packed up their cases and flown back to their glass towers of certainty, Ben made a call to one of his former engineering leads at a biomedical firm he once funded. Within 48 hours, a discreet team arrived at the estate, carrying a custom-designed biometric rig, non-invasive, wireless, and precise to the millisecond. They worked through the night in silence, affixing microsensors to Eli's temples, upper cheeks, and eyelids, calibrated to detect even the most imperceptible shifts in muscular activity. A second band was placed around his chest to monitor heart rate variability in real time. Everything was routed through a custom dashboard Ben could access from his laptop or phone, feeding him minute-by-minute reports like financial data. He didn't care if it looked obsessive. He needed proof. The footage had shown a blink. He needed to know if it was truly intentional or merely electrical noise in a dying system. Once the setup was complete, Ben instructed the house staff to leave Eli's room undisturbed for the rest of the day, all except Grace. He didn't speak to her. He didn't explain. He simply waited. From his study, he watched her enter the room, as always, mop and bucket in hand, humming softly as she moved toward the window. His screen lit up with data-resting heart rate, steady ocular microactivity baseline flat. Then, as she approached the bed still humming that same lullaby, something shifted. A pulse. A spike. A twitch recorded at the outer corner of Eli's right eyelid, tiny but statistically significant. Then again. Heart rate up by 3 beats. It was all there in numbers at last. Ben sat back staring at the data stream, his breath caught somewhere between fear and awe. For the first time, emotion and logic weren't at odds, they were aligned. The machines didn't lie. Something in Eli was responding. And somehow, impossibly, it was Grace who had reached him. Grace Ramirez continued to arrive each morning just before the sun rose, her canvas bag slung over one shoulder, her steps quiet against the marble floors of the Walker estate. She had no idea about the biometric sensors now placed on Eli's body, no knowledge of the silent data streams Ben monitored from his study, or the digital dashboards capturing every nuance of the boy's physiology. To Grace, Eli was still just Eli, a boy she greeted with a soft, "Good morning, cariño," as she opened the blinds to let in the early light, a boy who deserved kindness, even in his stillness. She moved around the room with her usual rhythm, wiping surfaces, folding linens, and humming softly under her breath, never realizing that her presence was now the variable in a secret experiment. But she wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to heal, impress, or fix. She was simply with him. And in that quiet, consistent witness, something began to shift, not just in Eli's body, but in the atmosphere of the room itself. Grace would sometimes pause her work and sit beside him for a moment, telling him stories about her hometown in the high desert, about the orange trees that used to bloom outside her window, or how her abuela believed music could keep a soul tethered to the earth. She would smile gently, brush her hand lightly across his bedsheet, not touching him, but close enough that warmth could travel. Her voice never rose above a whisper, and yet it filled the space like something sacred. She danced less now, sensing perhaps that movement wasn't always needed. Instead, she lingered, her stillness just as powerful as her steps had been. She didn't know that somewhere behind hidden screens and sensor logs, every beat of Eli's heart and twitch of his eyelids were being recorded and analyzed. She didn't know that her presence had become the constant that Ben's system couldn't explain. All she knew was that this boy, silent and unmoving, deserved to be seen. And so she showed up not as a miracle worker, not as a therapist, but as a woman who believed that even the smallest acts of attention could awaken something long asleep. It began subtly, so subtly that even Grace didn't notice at first. A shift in the way Eli's eyes seemed to settle not just in vacant space, but toward her. At first it was fleeting, a glance that could easily be dismissed as coincidence, but then came another longer this time, tracking her quietly as she moved across the room with her mop. Grace, unaware of the sensors, silently capturing every nuance, continued her routine humming as she always did, her voice steady and calm. But behind the scenes, Ben saw it all. The cameras recorded the motion of Eli's pupils, slight but undeniable, following Grace's steps with a level of precision that could no longer be attributed to chance. Even the biometric dashboard lit up with patterns. His heart rate showed small rhythmic spikes when she entered, when she passed close, and most consistently, when she began to sing. It wasn't just blinking anymore. It was recognition. It was attention. Grace began to feel something too, though she couldn't name it. There was a warmth in the room now, as though the air responded to her presence differently. One afternoon, as she sang a slow verse from the lullaby about a bird who never forgot its way home, she paused for a breath, and Eli's lower eyelid twitched in response. Her eyes widened slightly. Did you hear that she whispered more to herself than to him? He didn't blink again, but his gaze remained locked on her, not above her, not beyond, but on her. Grace took a step to the left slowly, and his eyes followed. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped right. His eyes moved again. "Mi cielo," she said softly, voice trembling now. "Can you see me?" His lips didn't part. His limbs didn't move, but the answer pulsed in the stillness between them. He was there, still trapped in silence. Yes, but there. And she could feel it, not because of machines or screens, but because something in her heart told her so. Grace, for the first time, allowed herself to believe she wasn't dancing alone. It was late one afternoon when Grace finally spoke about him. She and Nancy were in the laundry room folding linens, the quiet hum of the dryer filling the space between them. Outside, the Kentucky sky was darkening with the promise of rain, and inside the Walker house something had been shifting softly, unmistakably since Eli first blinked. Grace's hands moved gently over a stack of towels, her gaze distant, her voice low when she said almost absently, "My little brother used to hum to himself when he was scared." Nancy paused mid-fold, glancing at her. Grace didn't look up, just kept smoothing the fabric like she was working through memory. His name was Mateo. He wasn't sick like Eli, not in the body anyway. But our mother had him when she was just 16. The father was a married man, a powerful one. So she was sent away to have the baby and Mateo. Her voice wavered for the first time. He was hidden, kept in a house outside the city with an aunt who didn't want him. No school, no friends, just books, silence, and shame. Nancy stayed quiet, letting the story come as it wanted to. Grace pressed her hand flat on a sheet as though anchoring something fragile. They said it was for his own good, that he didn't need the world, that the world didn't need to know about him. He believed them for a long time, until one day he stopped humming, stopped speaking. He was still breathing, still eating, but something inside just dimmed. She swallowed hard. I was only a kid, but I remember sneaking into his room and dancing. Just little steps like I do with Eli. It was the only time he'd look at me. Nancy reached out and gently touched Grace's arm. Grace finally met her eyes. So when I saw Eli, she whispered, I recognized that silence. Not broken, not empty, just waiting. And in that moment, Nancy understood Grace hadn't come to heal someone else's child. She had come to find the brother the world had erased. That evening, as a soft rain began to fall over the hills of Ashford Hollow, Grace found herself lingering outside Eli's room longer than usual. The hallway was dim quiet except for the occasional creak of old wood and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. She clutched a small cloth pouch in her hand, the stitching frayed at the edges, something that had lived in the bottom of her bag for years, without purpose until now. Inside was a faded photograph, barely the size of her palm, of a young boy with dark curls and wide eyes standing barefoot beside a rusted gate. Mateo. It was the only image she had of him taken without permission, before he was moved again deeper into hiding, further away from the world that never wanted to claim him. She had carried it through every job, every apartment, every city she'd cleaned her way through, but this was the first time she'd taken it out in years. And now, as she placed it gently inside the drawer of the small table beside Eli's bed, something within her clicked, a quiet sense of rightness, like one story had folded into another. She didn't know Ben had been watching from the study, that the cameras picked up her every motion, that he zoomed in on the worn photograph as she slid it into place. He recognized the boy's face, not the name, but the eyes. Familiar. Too familiar. And suddenly a file from decades ago surfaced in his mind, buried under layers of NDAs and legal fog. He couldn't place it yet, but something about that boy, that gate, tugged at the edges of his memory like a warning. Grace, unaware, kissed her fingers and pressed them gently to the drawer before turning out the light. The past had cracked open just slightly, just enough for a name to slip through the silence. And though no one said it aloud, the story was no longer just Eli's. It never had been. The house was unusually quiet that morning, the kind of silence that felt heavier than usual, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Grace arrived just after dawn, the air outside still cool with the last whispers of night. She moved through the house with practiced ease past the polished banisters and long halls, carrying the same canvas bag, the same soft determination in her steps. When she reached Eli's room, she paused. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of soft light spilling into the corridor, and for a moment she wondered if Nancy had arrived early. But when she stepped inside, what she saw made her freeze. Ben Walker, always composed, always distant, always in control, was slumped forward in the chair beside his son's bed, his arms folded against the mattress, his head resting against them, his breathing deep and uneven. He was asleep. Not the kind of sleep born from comfort or peace, but the kind born from exhaustion so complete that even fear must surrender to it. His suit jacket was wrinkled, his tie loosened, a soft shadow of stubble darkening his jaw. One of his hands was resting near Eli's inches away, and his entire body leaned toward the child as if gravity itself was trying to hold them together. Grace stood there for a long moment, watching this man who had never once spoken more than a few clipped words to her, who monitored everything from behind glass and screens, now collapsed in the raw, vulnerable posture of a father who had run out of ways to stay strong. Quietly, almost instinctively, she set down her bag and walked closer, her footsteps light, her presence gentle. She knelt beside him, not making a sound, and for a brief second simply watched the steady rise and fall of his shoulders. Then, with a hand that had soothed feverish children and scrubbed floors until her fingers bled, she reached out and placed it lightly on his shoulder. She didn't shake him. She didn't speak. She just let her hand rest there, warm, human, and present. Something in his body shifted slightly, not in alarm but in recognition, as though even in sleep he understood that someone was there, not out of duty, but out of care. Grace looked at Eli, his still face bathed in the morning light, and then at Ben, who in this rare moment had stopped being a CEO, or a man of data, or a watcher from behind glass. He was just a father exhausted by love. And in that wordless gesture, no bigger than a breath, something between them changed. Not everything, not yet. But the first layer of distance cracked not with explanation or proof, but with presence. And for the first time, Grace didn't feel like an outsider in this house. She felt just a little like she belonged. That night, long after the house had gone still, and the only sound was the quiet hum of machines beside Eli's bed, Ben sat alone in the chair where he had fallen asleep the night before. The room was bathed in low golden light from the reading lamp, casting soft shadows on the walls. He had dismissed the rest of the staff hours earlier, even Nancy, who had lingered at the door, before nodding in quiet understanding. Grace had finished her shift and left without a word, though her presence still clung to the space, her scent, her silence, the faint vibration of kindness she left behind. Ben sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, fingers steepled beneath his chin. His eyes were fixed on his son. Eli hadn't moved. Not visibly, not since the blink, but somehow Ben no longer saw a body frozen in stillness. He saw something else, something awake behind those quiet eyes. He let out a slow breath, then leaned forward, resting his hand gently on the blanket that covered Eli's leg. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and low, as if unused for anything real in a long time. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "No one taught me how to sit still, how to stay." His eyes glistened, but the tears didn't fall. "I thought, if I controlled everything, if I built the safest world possible, you'd come back to me." He looked away, ashamed. "I tracked your pulse, your eyes, your breath. I turned your healing into a project, just another thing to solve." He paused, swallowing the ache that rose in his throat. "But I never stopped to ask if you needed a solution, or just a father." His voice cracked on the last word. "I'm sorry, Eli. I'm so damn sorry." For a long moment, silence filled the room again, thick, unbroken. And then something in Ben shifted, not physically, but deeply, invisibly. He leaned forward, placed his forehead gently against the edge of the bed, and stayed there. No data, no dashboard, no witnesses, just presence. His hand moved slightly, brushing the edge of Eli's arm, not expecting a miracle, just offering warmth. In that moment, Ben wasn't performing fatherhood. He was living it messy, uncertain, imperfect. He whispered again, this time softer, almost like a prayer. "I'm here, son. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in a long while, the silence in the room didn't feel empty. It felt full. Full of sorrow, of love, of something beginning again, not through action, but through quiet, undemanding presence. It was purely by accident, at least. That's what Nancy told herself later. She had been sorting through old storage boxes in the basement archive, trying to reorganize decades of family records that had been left untouched since Walter Walker's death. Dust clung to the air like memory, and the boxes, all marked in her late employer's sharp handwriting, were stacked in deliberate order: financial records, legal documents, foundation papers. But one box, labeled simply Confidential Personal, WW, had no other markings. Curious Nancy pried it open and began to sift through the contents: wills, land deeds, a few brittle photographs of properties she barely recognized. And then, folded between two property contracts, she found a thin manila envelope with a red wax seal partially broken. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a birth certificate, yellowed and creased but still legible. The name leapt out at her before her mind could make sense of it. Grace Elena Ramirez. Her eyes widened as she scanned the document. Mother Elena Martinez. Father not listed. Date of birth 1993. Place of birth Rio Vista Clinic, Santa Fe, New Mexico. What caught Nancy's breath, though, was the stamp in the bottom corner, an embossed seal from the Walker Family Trust Legal Division. Not a government seal, a private one. And beneath it, handwritten in unmistakable ink and script, were the initials W.W. Walter Walker. Her stomach turned. Why would Ben's father have this girl's birth certificate locked in a private legal file? Why was there no father's name? Why was this document hidden outside of any legal archive, folded away like an inconvenience? Nancy stood still for a long time, the certificate trembling in her hands. Bits of dust floated in the shaft of light from the narrow window behind her, and in that silence realization began to form. This wasn't just a forgotten piece of paper. It was a secret buried deliberately. And suddenly everything about Grace, her kindness, her instinct with Eli, her silent sadness, felt heavier, more fragile, more important. Nancy slipped the paper carefully back into the envelope and pressed it to her chest. The past wasn't done speaking yet. Nancy sat alone at the edge of her bed that evening, the birth certificate trembling in her lap, the weight of what she had discovered pressing down on her chest like a stone. She had worked for the Walker family for over 30 years, had watched Ben grow from a stoic boy into a man of calculated precision, had witnessed Walter Walker rule the household with iron expectations and a cold, unyielding logic. But never had she imagined that the man who insisted on order and legacy above all else would bury a child. Yet the truth now stared back at her from that fragile paper, undeniable and damning. Grace Elena Ramirez, born to Elena Martinez, no father listed, but the legal stamp from the Walker Family Trust made it clear Walter had known, had handled it, had hidden it, and Grace, with her dark hair, her quiet fire, and her aching tenderness for Eli, had walked into this house never knowing she belonged to it by blood. Nancy's breath caught as the pieces aligned. The reason Walter insisted on relocating Elena Martinez out of state during his final business expansion. The vague mutterings of a discretionary trust created that same year. And the sealed letters Nancy had once been ordered to shred unopened. She hadn't questioned it then. She'd been too loyal, too afraid of Walter's wrath. But now she understood Grace wasn't just a kind stranger or a lucky coincidence. She was Ben's half-sister, conceived in secrecy, born out of wedlock, and erased from the official record to protect the Walker name. And Ben didn't know. Nancy pressed a trembling hand to her lips, the enormity of it settling in. This woman who had reached Eli in a way no doctor or therapist ever could. This woman who had touched Ben's shoulder with compassion when he finally broke, was his sister. They shared blood, loss. The same man who shaped Ben into steel had abandoned Grace into silence, and now fate or something larger had brought her back. Nancy looked toward the hallway, toward the rooms where Ben and Eli slept, unaware of the truth circling them. The question wasn't whether to tell, it was how, because this house wasn't built for honesty. And yet maybe now it was time to break that silence. Grace moved through the house with her usual quiet grace, unaware of the storm gathering just outside the edge of her knowing. She wiped windows, folded linens, tended to Eli's space with a tenderness that felt more like devotion than duty. Nothing in her posture betrayed the truth now buried inside the walls around her. She hummed softly that day a melody from her childhood, one her mother used to sing while combing her hair before sunrise. It floated gently through the hallways past the study, where Ben sat reviewing data logs, past the staircase where Nancy stood motionless, one hand gripping the rail, the other clenching the envelope that held Grace's birth certificate. Nancy had been holding onto it for nearly 2 days now, the edges softening from how many times she'd unfolded and refolded it, reading the words again and again, as though repetition could somehow dull their meaning. But the truth never dulled. It sharpened. And now it pressed against her from the inside like a secret too big to carry alone. She had tried to tell herself it wasn't her place, that maybe it would only cause pain, only. That perhaps it didn't matter anymore. Grace had made her way back here by her own hands, her own heart, and maybe that was enough. But the lies she had once allowed to pass quietly under Walter Walker's reign still haunted her, and she wasn't sure she could be complicit again, not this time. Still, every time she looked at Grace, that old fear stirred. Would revealing the truth unravel everything, just as it was beginning to mend? Would Ben recoil? Would Grace feel betrayed by a family she never knew she had? Nancy watched her now, the young woman kneeling beside Eli's chair, brushing his hair back with tender fingers, speaking softly about the birds outside the window and the color of morning light. And Nancy's heart ached, not just from the weight of the secret, but from the realization that Grace had no idea she already belonged here, that her blood ran through these walls, that she was not just a guest in this house, but its missing thread. And yet Nancy said nothing. Not yet. Because some truths, no matter how urgent, must wait until the heart is ready to hear them. Ben Walker hadn't expected the backlash, not like this. He stood in the middle of the private conference room adjacent to Eli's suite, arms folded tightly across his chest, as Dr. Madeline Hurst, the lead neurologist assigned to Eli's case, glared at him with barely contained disbelief. "You're not serious," she said, her voice sharp, clipped. "You want the janitor to become part of Eli's treatment team." Ben didn't flinch. "Her name is Grace Ramirez," he said evenly, "and I've seen more responsiveness from Eli in her presence than in 6 months of medical protocol." Madeline scoffed, pacing. "She is untrained, unlicensed. We have occupational therapists, speech specialists, neuropsychiatrists, real professionals with actual degrees in oversight." Her tone was brittle with offense, her posture stiff with disapproval. "You're proposing that we throw that all away for what a feeling?" Ben's jaw clenched. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm adding someone who clearly evokes a reaction. We've seen it." He follows her voice. His eye movement spikes when she enters the room. "That's not anecdotal, Madeline. That's data." But Madeline's voice rose over his. "You've lost objectivity. I know this is your son, and I respect your desperation, but this is bordering on negligent. Do you understand the precedent it sets if we let an unqualified civilian lead emotional therapy for a comatose child?" Ben didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted to the monitor where a paused security feed showed Grace in Eli's room humming softly while organizing the shelves. "What precedent?" he finally said. "That we pay attention when something works." Madeline's face hardened. "You're gambling with your son's future because you're what touched by a housekeeper's compassion." Her words hit sharp, but Ben didn't retreat. "No," he said. "I'm choosing presence over protocol, and I'm not asking for your permission. I'm informing you." The room fell silent. Madeline's lips pressed into a thin line her authority challenged in a way she wasn't used to. But Ben no longer cared about hierarchy. For the first time he was choosing what felt right, not just what looked right on paper. And Grace was no longer invisible. She was becoming the most vital piece of Eli's quiet recovery. Dr. Madeline Hurst stared at Ben like he had abandoned every ounce of logic he once prized. "You're a man of systems, Ben, of strategy. You built an empire on predictability. You don't get to rewrite protocol just because a woman sings lullabies near your son's bedside." Her voice was cold, authoritative, laced with the kind of academic superiority that had cowed boardrooms and silenced lesser men. But Ben didn't blink. He stood still, unmoved, his gaze fixed on the framed photo of Eli on the shelf behind her, a boy smiling wide, taken months before the accident. This isn't about rewriting anything he said slowly, the words deliberate. It's about responding to what's real, even if it doesn't fit neatly into your framework. Madeline crossed her arms. You can't measure healing through instinct. You need controlled variables, peer-reviewed studies, insurance compliance. You can't just let feelings dictate care. Her words landed like cold glass against steel, but Ben's voice, when it came next, wasn't cold. It burned with something deeper. Resolve. Madeline, he said, eyes steady. I don't need to prove a miracle. I just need it to happen. The room went still. The silence that followed wasn't uncertain. It was a reckoning, the kind that comes when a man finally steps out from behind the armor of reason and chooses faith instead. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Every method we've used, every textbook approach has led us here. Eli, frozen motionless, unreachable. And yet the day Grace sang to him, he blinked. He followed her with his eyes. His heart rate changed. You call it anecdotal. I call it a signal. He let the weight of his words settle before adding, I'm done waiting for the perfect case study. My son doesn't have time for red tape. If Grace is the only one who reaches him, then she stays. Madeline's face tightened, but she said nothing, because in that moment she realized this wasn't just a CEO making an emotional call. This was a father willing to bend reality to give his son a chance, not to explain a miracle, but to let it live. Madeline Hurst's expression darkened as Ben's words settled between them like smoke, unwelcome, lingering hard to breathe through. She stepped back, folding her arms tightly, her spine rigid with disbelief. You're letting emotion cloud your judgment, she said, voice sharp, each syllable clipped like a diagnosis. You're abandoning evidence-based care for a fantasy. She pointed toward the thick binder on the desk behind her. Eli's medical file filled with charts, neuroscans, therapy logs, expert evaluations from the top pediatric specialists in the country. That, she continued, is science. That is the result of decades of research, of tested interventions, of carefully monitored progress. Her eyes locked onto Ben's. And you're throwing it away for the feeling that a cleaning woman is magically reaching your son. Ben didn't speak. He didn't flinch. His silence only deepened her frustration. Do you even hear yourself? She pressed. You're willing to hand over your son's recovery to someone with no training, no licensure, no clinical oversight because she makes you feel something. Her voice wasn't just angry now. It was frightened. You built an empire by refusing to be ruled by emotion. Don't forget that. Don't let grief turn you into a man who trades method for myth. Ben finally raised his eyes slow and steady. I'm not trading anything, he said calmly. I'm expanding the method, adding what the science has ignored. Madeline stepped closer, lowering her voice as if trying to reach whatever logic might remain in him. You're on dangerous ground, Ben. If word gets out that you're allowing an unlicensed, undocumented emotional therapist to lead part of Eli's care, the liability alone could destroy everything. Your credibility, your custody rights, the foundation, everything you've worked for. Ben didn't budge, but something in his face flickered. Madeline saw it. Sorrow, hope, resolve all tangled together. So she delivered her final blow, soft but cold. You're letting emotion destroy science, and when it fails, you'll be left with nothing but regret. Then she turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind her, just wide enough for doubt to creep in. The rain came softly that evening, a quiet percussion on the roof like a heartbeat the house had forgotten. Most of the staff had gone home, and the mansion was shrouded in a hush broken only by the occasional groan of old wood settling. Grace stood near the French doors that opened onto the back veranda, holding Eli in her arms, his thin frame wrapped gently in a shawl she had brought from her own home, faded but warm. The rain didn't scare her. In fact, it comforted her. It reminded her of New Mexico storms when she and her brother would sit by the window and imagine they were floating. She looked down at Eli. His eyes were open, not wide, but aware, tracing the curve of her face as she smiled softly at him. No machines followed them tonight. No beeping monitors, no graphs or wires. Just the sound of rain and the breath between them. She stepped barefoot onto the slick wooden porch, the breeze kissing her skin with cool honesty. Slowly, she knelt down, letting Eli rest against her shoulder. His body was still unmoving, but his presence was no longer empty. He was there. She could feel it. And so, for reasons she didn't fully understand, Grace placed his tiny hand over her chest, pressing it gently against her heart. She covered it with her own and began to hum, not a lullaby, not a song, even just a rhythm. A quiet thrum of life. And then she stood holding him as though he were a sleeping child and began to sway. It was not a dance for performance. It was not rehearsed. It was slow, tender, more prayer than movement. The kind of dance that comes from a soul asking to be seen. She let the rhythm guide her, the rain her breath, the hope she wasn't ready to say aloud. With each step, she let her own grief fall away, grief for the brother she lost, for the life she never got to claim. Eli's hand remained over her heart the entire time, and for the first time she felt his fingers twitch ever so slightly in sync with the beat. Grace closed her eyes and kept dancing, because even if no one else believed her heart did, and now maybe so did his. The rain had softened into a mist by the time Grace began to slow her dance, still holding Eli gently in her arms, his hand resting just over her heart. The melody she hummed was nothing more than memory, now a blend of grief and hope carried in the rhythm of her breath. She whispered to him softly in Spanish words. Only the soul could interpret gentle, timeless words about stars and warmth and how the body remembers even when the mind forgets. Then, as she turned slightly, the worn wooden porch groaning under her feet, she felt a shift not in the air, but in the boy she carried. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. Eli moved. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of movement you'd see in a miracle movie or in a viral headline. But to Grace, it was everything. His neck, long frozen in a fixed position, twitched then slowly with a delicate strain that made her breath catch it turned. His head turned. Not far. Just a few inches. But enough to face her. Enough to follow the fading trace of her melody. His gaze, once blank and distant, now sought her face, drawn not by logic or command, but by recognition. Something inside him had reached back. Grace gasped, but didn't say a word. She knew instinctively that the moment needed silence more than celebration. Her hands tightened just slightly around him, anchoring him in safety, while tears welled quietly in her eyes. Eli's lips didn't move. His fingers didn't lift. But his head had turned. He had made a choice, not a reflex, not a neurological spike, but a willful, aching choice to find her through the fog. The boy who hadn't moved in over 6 months had responded to music to presence to something science hadn't accounted for. She whispered again, barely audible, "I see you, mi cielo." And though he didn't answer, his eyes stayed with her, steady, searching, as if asking her not to stop. Grace didn't. She resumed the dance slower now, more reverent, a conversation without words between two broken hearts, learning how to listen. Ben hadn't meant to watch. He hadn't even known what had drawn him to the security monitors that evening. Maybe it was the rain, soft and insistent, tapping against the window panes like a long-forgotten memory. Maybe it was the silence of the house, an unfamiliar, almost sacred hush that made him feel like something was about to shift. Or maybe deep down, some part of him had known that tonight would be different. He clicked into the camera feed for the rear veranda and froze. There, in the dim glow of the porch light, was Grace barefoot and drenched with mist, swaying slowly with Eli cradled in her arms. The image alone pierced him, but it was what happened next that shattered him entirely. He saw Eli move. Ben leaned closer to the screen, disbelieving. His heart pounded. For a moment, he was sure it was a trick of shadow or light. But then Eli's neck twitched deliberately, slowly, painfully, and turned toward Grace, toward the sound of her voice. Ben's hand flew to his mouth. He couldn't speak, couldn't think. For months he had lived by numbers and charts, by scans and silence. He had sat beside his son every night saying nothing, feeling nothing, as if the absence of movement was a death he wasn't allowed to grieve. And now, with no doctors present, no machines attached, his son had made a choice. He had turned toward love. Ben didn't wait. He ran, down the stairs past the quiet halls, out the back doors into the rain-soaked night. When he stepped onto the veranda, Grace turned startled but said nothing. She didn't need to. He saw the tears already falling from her face, matching his own. Without a word, she gently handed Eli into his arms. Ben took him awkwardly at first, uncertain, as if afraid the boy might break, but then he folded around his son, pressing his cheek against Eli's damp hair. And he wept. For the months lost. For the guilt he'd buried. For the miracle he hadn't dared to ask for. "I'm here," he whispered over and over. "I'm here, I'm sorry." And for the first time in nearly half a year, Eli blinked and didn't look away. It was early morning when Nancy found Grace in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of chamomile tea, the steam rising between them like something sacred and unsaid. The storm had passed, but the air still felt heavy with something unfinished. Nancy hesitated in the doorway, unsure of how to begin. She had carried the truth for days now, like a stone in her chest, growing heavier with every quiet miracle that unfolded in that house. Grace looked up, her eyes tired but soft, expectant, in a way that unnerved Nancy. So much had changed in so little time. Eli's blink, his movement, Ben's collapse into fatherhood. But what Nancy was about to say would reshape everything again. She sat down across from Grace and reached into her cardigan pocket, pulling out a folded yellowed paper. "There's something you need to see," she said gently. Grace looked at it, puzzled. "What is it?" "Your birth certificate," Nancy replied, sliding it across the table. Grace unfolded the document slowly. Her breath caught before she even finished reading. There it was. Her name. Her mother's name. And under father, a name she'd never expected to see: Walter Edwin Walker. She blinked, trying to make sense of it, her fingers trembling against the paper. This is a mistake," she said, voice thin. "It can't be." Nancy's eyes filled with compassion. "I wish it were. But it's not. I found it in your father's archives, hidden, tucked behind years of expense reports and foundation documents. You weren't supposed to know. No one was. Your mother was a housekeeper he met before he married Ben's mother. He paid her to disappear. You were the secret child." Grace shook her head, but not in denial, in slow, stunned disbelief. "That means—" "Yes," Nancy whispered, her hand closing gently over Grace's. "Ben is your half-brother, and Eli is your nephew." The silence that followed was sharp and fragile, like the moment before glass breaks. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. She didn't have to. The truth had rooted itself deep, unshakable. Her entire life she'd believed she was invisible, unwanted, peripheral. But in that moment everything realigned. She hadn't stumbled into this house by accident. She'd come home. Grace stood in the quiet hallway outside the kitchen, the faded birth certificate still clutched in her hand, though the words had long blurred from her sight. Her feet felt planted in two different worlds, neither of which she fully recognized anymore. The woman who had walked into this house weeks ago, a part-time cleaner with no ties, no claim, no voice, was suddenly gone. In her place stood someone with blood in the walls, history in the air, and a name that now connected her to people she had only served, never belonged to. She had always thought her past was something sealed behind silence and loss, something to survive, not investigate. Now it was erupting all around her, dragging her back into a lineage she never asked for. Her chest rose and fell in unsteady rhythms as the truth clawed its way through the defenses she had spent a lifetime building. She wasn't just the woman who danced in the hallway or sang lullabies in secret. She was Eli's aunt, Ben's sister, a Walker. And yet, she wasn't. She didn't grow up in their privilege, didn't eat at their table, wasn't taught to carry their name like armor. She had scrubbed kitchens and buried her brother without flowers, learned how to smile without being seen. So who was she now? A stranger with shared blood, a ghost of someone they buried in paperwork and silence. Grace felt something like grief blooming inside her, not for a lost person, but for a lost version of herself. Her identity was being rewritten without her consent, and the disorientation was almost unbearable. She had found purpose here, connection through Eli healing in Ben's eyes, organic earned sacred. But now every moment risked being recast as fate or coincidence or worse, pity. Was she loved because she mattered or because she was family? The weight of the truth didn't feel like belonging. It felt like erasure. Like the world she had finally begun to build for herself was being ripped in half by a name she never asked to carry. Torn between the blood that ignored her and the bond that saved her, Grace stood frozen heart stretched across two worlds, unsure which one she was allowed to claim. Grace sat alone in the laundry room late that night, folding Eli's pajamas with a meticulousness that masked the storm inside her. The rhythm of fabric over fabric was the only thing keeping her grounded, a fragile ritual in a world that had suddenly tilted. She had made her decision. She would leave quietly, without explanation, without farewell. There would be no dramatic goodbyes, no confessions of identity, no disruptions to the delicate thread of healing that had only just begun to weave itself through the household. Ben and Eli had come so far, and she wouldn't be the one to unravel that progress by injecting confusion, guilt, or legacy into a space that had finally found peace. Her presence had served its purpose. Eli had moved. Ben had softened. That was more than enough. She told herself it was the right thing to do, that leaving was an act of love, not cowardice. If she stayed, everything would change. Her name would shift the dynamic. Every shared glance with Ben would become heavy with implication. Every moment with Eli would be scrutinized under the lens of family and history. She had come into their lives as Grace Ramirez, a quiet woman with nothing but a mop, a song, and a soul full of stories. She wasn't ready to become Grace Walker. Not like this. Not when it meant risking the fragile trust that had been built not just between them, but within herself. She packed slowly, methodically, the way she had done in a dozen rooms across her life. No one would know. She'd leave at dawn. A note, maybe. Something simple. Thank you. Take care of him. Nothing more. She didn't need credit. She didn't need recognition. And maybe that's what made it all so unbearably heartbreaking, because for the first time, she had found something close to home, and she was choosing to walk away from it for the sake of the people inside. A family she could have called her own, if life had drawn the lines differently. She wiped her tears, folded the last shirt, and whispered into the silence, "Better this way." But even as she said it, her heart trembled. Grace had her hand on the doorknob when she heard his voice, low, steady, and aching with something she wasn't prepared to face. "I used to think not having a sister didn't matter," Ben said from behind her. She froze. Her suitcase, modest and worn, stood at her feet like a silent witness to her resolve, but that one sentence made the air shift. Slowly she turned. Ben stood a few feet away, barefoot, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept. "I didn't know I had one." He continued, his voice tight. "But now that I do, don't make my son lose her too." His words struck like thunder, quiet but devastating. Grace opened her mouth, but no sound came. She had prepared herself for silence, for departure, for fading without causing a ripple. She hadn't prepared for this, to be seen, to be needed, to be wanted, not just as a caretaker or a miracle worker, but as family. "Ben," she finally whispered, her voice cracking, "you don't owe me anything. I didn't come here to... I know why you came." He cut in gently, stepping closer. "And I know you didn't ask for this. Neither did I. But that doesn't make it any less real. You're my sister, Grace. You're Eli's aunt. And for the first time in this house, something feels... whole." He took a breath, struggling to stay composed. "You brought music into silence. You brought movement into stillness. You brought me back to my son. I don't care what our father did. I care what you did." Grace blinked, her throat tightening. "I just wanted to help. And you did, more than anyone, which is why I can't let you walk out that door. Not without knowing that you matter here, that we need you, not as staff, as family." She looked down, hand trembling on the doorknob. "It's complicated." Ben nodded. "So is love. So is healing. But we start where we are. Please, Grace, Stay. Not for me. For him. He motioned toward the hallway where Eli slept. He's already lost too much. Don't let him lose this too. Grace didn't say yes. She didn't say anything at all. Her fingers slipped from the doorknob, her eyes brimming her chest, rising in sharp, uneven breaths. Ben didn't move either, didn't pressure her, didn't fill the silence with pleading. He just stood there, his expression raw and unguarded in a way she'd never seen. The distance between them was filled with unspeakable things, decades of lies. Neither of them authored a childhood, never shared a bloodline they'd only just discovered. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Grace stepped back from the door. Her suitcase remained by the threshold untouched, like a question suspended in air. She turned and walked past Ben without a word, and he followed, silent too, as if afraid that words might break whatever fragile thread had just been tied between them. They ended up in the sunroom, where the morning light was beginning to spill through the windows in soft streaks of gold. It was the place where Eli first blinked, the place where things had begun to shift. Grace sank into the old armchair in the corner, the same one she used to collapse into after hours of mopping. Ben sat down across from her knees, close posture, weary but open. And for a long time they didn't speak. They just sat in the stillness together, their breathing slowly sinking their grief, finally allowed to exist without pretense or performance. Tears slid down Grace's face, not loud or dramatic, just quiet and steady, like rain on glass. Across from her, Ben looked away, blinking quickly, but his own tears soon followed. He didn't wipe them, didn't hide them. This wasn't the kind of pain that needed to be concealed. It was the kind that had waited years to be witnessed. They didn't hug, they didn't reach for each other, but somehow the space between them narrowed all the same. Something unspoken passed back and forth in the silence, acknowledgement, forgiveness, shared mourning, a kind of beginning. And in that still morning, surrounded by truth and ache and newness, they cried, not because everything was broken, but because something had finally begun to mend. Later that evening, as the sky turned a dusky lavender and the house settled into its quiet rhythm again, Ben stood by the window in the sunroom, hands in his pockets, watching the breeze stir the trees outside. Grace sat nearby, exhausted, but calmer, the trace of dried tears still on her cheeks. He spoke softly, almost as if thinking aloud, but every word was weighted with something long considered. I've spent my whole life building things that move fast. He began, eyes still fixed on the horizon. Companies, systems, teams that respond in seconds, results that come in graphs and reports. But this house, this experience with Eli, with you, it's shown me that some of the most important things happen slowly, without noise, without proof, without even words. Grace looked up, silent, sensing something deeper in his voice. I want to create a space, Ben continued, turning to face her, a place that doesn't measure healing by productivity or recovery by metrics. A place that honors stillness, presence. The kind of connection you brought into this house when no one else knew how to reach my son. Grace didn't respond, but her expression shifted, a flicker of emotion in her eyes that he didn't miss. I want to call it the Stillness Center, he said. Not a hospital, not a lab, a sanctuary. For kids like Eli, kids who've been written off because they can't speak or move the way we expect. For families like ours who don't need more experts telling them what's impossible, they need space to breathe, to listen, to simply be with one another. He took a breath, voice steady now. I want movement to be sacred again. I want silence to be welcome. I want dance and song and quiet presence to be part of the care. Not an afterthought, the core. Grace stared at him, overwhelmed, her throat tightening with something between awe and disbelief. You're serious, she whispered. Ben nodded. Completely. I've seen what it can do. You showed me. Now I want the world to see it too. I want this house to be the first light, and from here we build. The sun poured gently over the newly painted sign, the Stillness Center. A modest crowd had gathered in front of the building, nestled on the edge of Maple Ridge where once a forgotten farmhouse stood. Now transformed into a place of hope, it welcomed its first day with soft music, rows of folding chairs, and faces full of quiet anticipation. Among them stood therapists, families, nurses, neighbors, and former skeptics who had heard whispers of the boy who had once lain silent and the woman who helped him move again. Grace stood behind the curtain, heart pounding. She smoothed Eli's shirt and knelt beside his wheelchair, whispering in Spanish the words she always had. "I'm right here." Eli, 9 years old and still blinked once, then twice. He recognized the music playing the same melody she once hummed on the tiles. She gently placed his small hand in hers and without announcement or fanfare guided him slowly onto the small wooden stage. The crowd fell silent. Grace didn't speak. She didn't need to. She only walked one step at a time with Eli's chair beside her, stopping center stage under the soft light of the morning sun. There was no miracle speech, no press release, just the simple presence of a boy once deemed unreachable, now surrounded by warmth and watching eyes, his aunt's hand in his father standing behind them. And in that still moment, everything the Stillness Center stood for was no longer theory. It was a live, visible breathing on stage in the form of love presence and one boy's fragile but defiant gaze toward the world. As the soft strains of a Spanish guitar filled the open-air courtyard, something subtle but extraordinary happened. Grace stood still beside Eli, her hand lightly resting on the back of his wheelchair, her eyes focused not on the crowd, but on the boy she had grown to love like her own. The notes of the melody drifted through the morning breeze, the same melody she had once hummed absent-mindedly while scrubbing floors. And then, as if drawn by something deeper than sound, Eli began to move. It was slight, a gentle shift of his shoulder, the slow turning of his head, but it was unmistakable. He turned toward the music, toward Grace, toward the world. A ripple of collective breath moved through the crowd, but no one said a word. They simply watched. And from the far left corner of the gathering, where a few new patients from the center had been seated quietly with their families, a small girl with bright, searching eyes and thick curls lifted her hand. She didn't speak, but she waved tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, her fingers fluttering in the air like a leaf catching wind. It was unclear whether she was waving at Eli or the music, or simply the feeling that something important was unfolding before her. But Eli, slow and sure, blinked once in her direction, and though he couldn't lift his hand in return, his gaze lingered on her face with unmistakable recognition. In that moment, under the morning sun and the hush of music connection, crossed space without words, without instructions, just presence. And that was enough. That was everything. Doctor. Madeline Hurst stood at the edge of the gathering, her arms folded tightly across her chest, not out of defiance, but in a quiet effort to steady herself against a tide of emotion she had long learned to suppress. She had come out of obligation more than belief, still skeptical of the entire concept behind the Stillness Center, still rooted in decades of clinical training that taught her to trust only what could be quantified, charted, replicated. But as the music played and the courtyard held its collective breath, something within her began to shift. She watched Eli turn his head toward the sound, saw the little girl respond as if tethered by some invisible thread, and noticed the way the entire space seemed to breathe as one. It wasn't a miracle, not in the medical sense, but it was something real, something felt, something that no chart could fully explain. Madeline's eyes lingered on Ben for a moment, then on Grace, then back to Eli. The boy had not spoken. He had not walked. But the stillness was no longer empty. It was purposeful, alive. She felt herself oddly out of place, as if the world had moved on to a language she had once known but forgotten. Without drawing attention, without applause or farewell, Dr. Hurst stepped back from the crowd. Her shoes clicked faintly against the stone as she turned and walked away. Not in shame, not in defeat, but in quiet acknowledgement that there were truths beyond data, truths that lived in presence, in silence, in motion, just barely visible to the eye. And as she passed through the gates of the Stillness Center, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. Something had spoken to her, and for the first time in a long while, she chose simply to listen. At the edge of the courtyard, just beyond the crowd's reach, Dr. Madeline Hurst stood still, her clipboard held tightly against her chest, though she wasn't taking notes anymore. Her eyes, usually sharp with clinical detachment, now lingered on the stage with something softer, something almost mournful. She had fought hard to keep emotion from clouding the science, had built a career on evidence certainty control. And yet, in that moment, as she watched a boy once pronounced unreachable turn his head toward music and a girl respond with a wordless wave, she felt the fault lines crack quietly beneath all her assumptions. No machines had prompted that connection. No charts had predicted it. It was grace. It was stillness. It was presence, something the textbooks never measured, something the data refused to define. Dr. Hurst did not applaud. She didn't offer congratulations or linger to be seen. Instead, she took a quiet step back, then another, retreating through the small side path lined with blooming lavender unnoticed by most. She paused briefly beneath the archway that marked the exit, glancing once more at the stage where healing had taken a form she hadn't prepared for. Then, with a silent nod to no one in particular, she turned and walked away. Not in defeat, but in quiet acknowledgement that perhaps there was more to medicine than what she'd allowed herself to believe. Some truths, she realized, are whispered, not declared. And sometimes the greatest miracles come not with answers, but with surrender. In a world that moves too fast, where productivity is worshipped and silence often mistaken for emptiness, the Stillness Center reminds us of something essential, that healing, connection, and love do not always arrive in dramatic flashes. They are often built in quiet moments, steady presence and acts of care that go unnoticed by the world, but are life-changing for the person receiving them. Ben Walker had all the tools that success promised: money, influence, data, access to the best experts. But none of it reached his son. It took Grace, a woman with no credentials, no accolades, just a quiet heart and consistent presence, to open the door to something far more powerful than medicine alone. In real life, this story teaches us that we don't always need to be experts to make a difference. You don't need the perfect words, degrees, or solutions. Sometimes being there, truly being present with someone in their pain, in their silence, in their stillness, is the most powerful act of all. If you're caring for someone who's struggling emotionally, physically, or spiritually, remember, you don't have to fix them. You just have to stay. Keep showing up. Healing is not a performance. It's a presence. And sometimes the quietest love is the one that brings someone back to life. If this story moved you, drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Save this video if you know someone who needs to hear this today. And don't forget to follow our channel for more powerful, human-centered stories like this one. You never know whose life your presence might touch.